You've reached the Homer Hotline with Dr. Kevin Solez. Please stand by.
Welcome, everybody, to the Homer Hotline. We are recording today from Lac-La-Biche County in Canada, and it's about Meme Basanidze, not baseball. It's about Sarpedon, not The Simpsons. This is the Homer Hotline, everybody, and today we have with us Joel Christensen. Christensen from the Graduate Center at City University, New York, where he is Provost and Senior Vice President Academic for Academic Affairs. Congratulations to you, Joel, and welcome to the Homer Hotline.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Kevin.
It's such a pleasure to have you here. And before I get to some more general questions, why don't you give listeners a précis of your recent book, Storylife? What can we expect if we read Storylife?
Well, so Storylife, I'll just let you know here, actually I have a copy of it on my shelf right next to me. It's a weird little book, but it's a book that is in part a product of the COVID period, where I really started to ask myself, there were two aspects to it. One was how does our approach to stories and narrative affect how we deal together in public? So I was really thinking about politics and vaccines and our response to the COVID pandemic, but also offered me a chance to think about things I've been teaching about for years in myth classes, which is thinking not about what is the right story, the correct story, but instead how narrative shifts and adapts to its context. And so it is a sustained series of biological analogies about where stories come from and how they adapt in the world. There's a strong form of it, which is the suggestion that narrative is alive, has its own agency and its own ends that don't line up with the people who tell the stories. But the weaker version, which is as serious, is that for all intents and purposes, narrative functions like a living thing. And we should treat it that way because we're not in control of it once it's released into the world. It adapts, it changes, and it can have both positive and deleterious effects. And so I build this up in a couple different ways. I talk about the nature of the structure of epic poetry. I talk about how it functions in a way analogous to DNA. And then I move on through chapters. I actually open the book to remind myself that talk about the bigger structures of early Greek narrative, about ring structures and how they function cognitively. I talk about how stories evolve. So I address things like the monomyth from the perspective of parallel evolution and divergent evolution. Then I address the the elephant in the room, how stories go viral and what it means. And then I really sort of close thinking about symbiotic relationships and how we're in a relationship with narrative that's symbiotic, but symbiosis can be, negative or positive. And so it goes from it uses Homeric poetry as the architecture to talk about narrative in general. And then at the end really thinks about, if we're treating narrative as if it's a virus or a parasite, how do we cope with that? How should we educate? How should we talk about it to live, I guess, more productively with narrative?
Yeah. I'm going to ask some follow-ups there. So
I
interesting.
figured you would, yeah.
Interesting concepts there. So what about the independence or dependence of narrative in that context? I've been writing a little bit about Christian Bock, but it's spelled B-O-umlaut-K. Mm-hmm. He's a Canadian poet, and he's recently worked with a professor at the University of Texas to genetically modify an extremophile bacteria so that its protein sequence encodes some of his English poetry. Okay, so original compositions from a human now encoded in an extremophile bacterium, and you can prod the extremophile bacterium to do things which will then switch the words around and make a new poem. Right. So there, that life form, that extremophile bacterium, it achieves an independence from human beings in its ability to communicate a narrative or a poem, which is different than the kind of independence you can achieve ordinarily. And so your conceptualization of narrative in this book, it sort of posits an independent biological life force within the narrative. And you say once it's out there, it kind of has its own life and it influences us and we're shaped by it, right? And we also shape it and it changes. And so that, but the idea that the narrative can do things that the human beings don't want it to do, which I think is a concept that you have engaged with also in the psychology book on the Odyssey, that sometimes our stories hurt us. QAnon hurts people who delve into stories hurt us. And I'm just in the world of oral epic. Do they really? Because isn't it necessary that the story adapts to the audience's desires and expectations, or not?
Yeah.
You know.
No, so I think you're asking exactly the right question there, and let me try to answer it like this without being evasive. So one of the things I really think about is about life not existing in isolation, right? We don't exist in isolation. We experience ourselves as individuals, but we're part of much more complex ecosystems, right? There's the ecosystem of our planet, right? We rely on carbon, oxygen, et cetera. But there are also, intellectual and emotional ecosystems of thought and mind and language that make all of this possible, right? So to think of anything as having an independent life force, I think is probably not accurate, right? Because our life force is always contingent. So that's one thing. On the other side of it, though, is the notion that in the natural world, anything is good or bad, right? It just is, right? Unless, and I'm, subtracting from this any notion of a religious metaphysics, right? Just looking at it from a pure evolutionary perspective, that again denies, let's say, intelligent design, and looking at the larger ecosystem, right? When things develop in an ecosystem, the ideal, or at least the sustainable thing, is some type of homeostasis, right? And so if you're in a system where every element of it is in some way self-reinforcing and creates a stasis, then that's one thing, right? You could imagine that as the ideal of a narrative situation in which the narratives help us to create identities, to perform and understand our place in the world in a way that's more or less sustainable. But things change, right? New things enter the system, right? That unbalance, right? Stasis is not actually very common if we think about laws of, the tension between inertia and entropy, right? And so, the thing is, like, a story is told for a particular context, and it works in that particular context. But then when the context shifts, it's problematic. Let me give you an example from the book to illustrate this. All right. I look in the book a lot at the problem of kleos, of immortal renown and glory, right? And I look at how it develops in different contexts, especially, like Athenian epigraphy, and the poetry of Callinus and Tyrtaeus. In a very simplistic way, the rhetoric of kleos assuages people's mortal concerns for facing death by guaranteeing them some life after death if they stand and defend their city, right? But once you subtract it from that particular context of defending a city so others can live, kleos can become a really dangerous story because it gets people to value not this life in reality, but something else, right? It's actually a non-homeostatic assertion, because you don't to get more life, you have to take away from others. Okay. And so that has a deleterious effect. And I think, to go to Homer, one of the points I make about Homer in the book is that Homeric poetry is far more complicated than any given narrative. And it can absorb the tensions, and actually, when read correctly, provides us the opportunity to be critical of narrative traditions, and in a way is an inoculant against narratives that run free of context, right? And my reading of the Iliad is that it's deeply critical of kleos and the very idea that you should give up life for glory, right?
Sure. Because the question of whether you should animates the thing. Is it good? Are the actions of this person good?
Right.
Because at the beginning I'm telling you, no, they're not really good.
But what happened?
But also he's a way better king than Agamemnon, and look at how his victories are shared with the collective, and he negotiates very pleasantly, mostly, and it right, because it is both warning of the terror when somebody like that gets into that mode of my kleos shall be satisfied, the rest of you be damned.
Yeah.
Right. There's that problem, and then but the thing that you and I probably disagree on, because I think I disagree with many Homerists on this point, but I don't know, is that Achilles gets what he was after.
No, he does.
He's not
denied
the things, and he just read Naj, and Best of the Achaeans. It's laid out plain, right?
Yeah. No,
the
Achilles
things that his fate promised him, or
wants.
whatever that he expected out of participating in the Trojan War, he definitely gets them. They're just every last one of them, I think.
Disappointing.
Yes, in getting them, there is disappointment, as he tells us in the Odyssey. Yeah.
No, but so I think the larger thing, it's not that narrative is bad. Narrative is neither bad nor good, right? The point is that narratives that are then separated from context and from richness and complexity end up being extremely dangerous, right? And so part of what I suggest is one, like a plurality of narratives in the same conversation is can help attenuate the dangers of harmful narratives, but conversation and engaging with narrative in a sophisticated way is also a way to countermand it, right? I think a great part of the dangers of what's happening with narrative in the 21st century is that our educational systems have been collapsing and have not been focusing on sort of the humanities. And at the same time, we're exposed to more information at a faster pace than we actually have the cognitive capacity to process.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. And that's a feeling that I'm familiar with now, but say, prior to 2012, I didn't know that feeling.
No,
I didn't know the feeling of being just flooded. I didn't know the feeling.
And the difference is in part the delivery devices, right? I mean, in 2012, probably you and I both probably had smartphones, right? But we weren't using them as much. They weren't fully keyed into social media. It wasn't a constant blaring. And we also grew up in a different cognitive informatics paradigm, right? We had the ability to develop.
Yeah. Because we have fortifications against the constant influence of the digital that I'm not sure my children do, but I try to provide it to them by making them go outside and carry sticks around the yard or whatever. But we are fortified. Who live on the cusp of Gen X and millennials or whatever they're calling us these days.
Well, I think the real key is like at what point in how developed was your sense of self and cognition when you first engaged with social media?
For sure.
Right.
That's great. So I think the second question I have for you dovetails on the first. So you are a Homerist who's very attentive to traditional, formal, formulaic elements in the epic. I know that from reading your work and from talking with you about this stuff. And you mentioned even in your discussion of Storylife, ring composition. Mm-hmm. The biological characteristics thereof. But yeah, sometimes I try to capture the largest scale narrative patterns. I find that pleasing intellectually. Mm-hmm. If I can zoom out and capture a very large scale narrative pattern that I see more than once, I think there's room for innovation and moving scholarship forward in that area. So there's withdrawal, devastation, return, for example.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. That's a big one. and that Homerists have been discussing for 100 years about sort of like, let's talk about this phenomenon and how we see it in the Homeric hymns and how we see it in the Iliad, and but I wanted to throw it to you and see which one of those large scale patterns is sort of the most interesting to you. What's the biggest scale pattern that you see in, let's say, archaic hexameter? Because it doesn't have to be Homer, but what do you think? You mentioned ring composition. That's kind
so
of
I think, so there are two. I mean, I actually think that there are two structures that get repeated and can basically describe most of what's happening in the structure of Homeric poetry. And the structures, you've already mentioned one, ring composition is one, and the second is the doublet. And so I'll explain this both at a micro level and a macro one, if you're willing, right?
Absolutely.
So the ring composition, and again, not sorry to talk again about the story life, but I talk about ring composition there as a reflection of, as well, human cognition and a model for reading. And I look at, or I invite people to look at speeches, similes, and similar constructions, because I think they anticipate a type of cognitive blending that the audience should have when engaging in the narrative. So let me do this quickly, right? Every simile has an opening. This thing is like that, right? So and then it goes through it, and then it closes, and so it was like that, right? But during the simile, things shift. You move from one thing to another, and there's often a concatenation of the details of the vehicle and the tenor, right? The tenor is the thing outside the simile. The vehicle is a simile that changes it. And in Homer, all the time, you get a blending. You either get features of the tenor that show up in the vehicle, like in this simile about Paris compared to a stallion at the end of book 6. The stallion is doing Paris things, while Paris is also doing horsey things, right?
Yes.
And then you also get shifts in the simile as if the narrator and the audience are looking into it deeply and seeing other things, right? Like warriors will be compared to boars, and then by the end of the simile, the boar's tusk is compared to a sword, and what we're actually thinking about is the sight or the sound of people watching the warriors, right? So it's constantly shifting and blending between the inside and the outside. Right. And I think that, so this to me reflects or confirms an approach to narrative from Mark Turner in The Literary Mind. And what he talks about, and I've described this to all ages, from like middle school kids to senior citizens and a retirement community. And it's a really simple thing, right? When you and I read a story, we don't see the same thing in our mind. What we see is a combination between the information we're being given and our own experiences, both our experiences of the world and our experiences of the story, right? Of stories in general. So if somebody tells us a story of a knight storming a castle and saving a princess, we'll visualize it differently with different details based on our embodied experiences, but also on our experiences of narrative, right? And the way we bring this closer together is by talking to each other about it. Okay. And so I think the ring structure has developed in Homer, or it has been selected by Greek poetry because it responds so fundamentally, or corresponds so fundamentally, to the way we experience narrative, and it's a guide. And the example I use in the book to sort of set it out is Sappho fragment 31. Right, where she starts out by saying, some people say the most beautiful thing on this black earth is a fleet of ships, or or cavalry. I say horses. It's the one you love, right? And then she goes to the story of Helen. So there's the outside, and then she provides a myth. And if you read the way she talks about Helen, she's at once Helen and someone looking at Helen, or is it that Anactoria is Helen? And then she moves out of that blend, and says, well, this is how I feel. It makes me think of Anactoria, and I'd rather watch her lovely walk than all of these things, going back to the beginning. And so that inside and outside, if you go through Greek poetry, Pindar, right?
Oh,
All of that, like all
yeah.
across the board, it's all about here's a proposition, here's a blending of the real world and the proposition, here's a comment on that, keep thinking about it. And then if you think about the performance of tragedy, the whole thing is about blending, right? So
Yeah.
that the ring
Yeah.
structure is fundamental to the way we experience narrative. Doublets are fundamental to the paratactic structure of orally composed poetry. And so for anybody who's listening, I'm going to gloss all of that, right? So typically, like someone like James Notopoulos is the first one I ever saw write about parataxis, right? And it contrasts generally with hypotaxis, which is the subordinating way we write and organize things in a literary context, right? Parataxis, you just keep adding things to it because you can't go back and edit. You can't change things in real time. Like if you're playing a song, you can't stop the song and start over and restructure the melody. Instead, what you
Mhm.
do is you rephrase the melody and you revisit it because there's no such thing as true repetition. Each
Yeah.
time you hear something, it's
Right.
changed,
A
right?
theme and variations kind of thing.
Right. And so like the critical like mistake of most people when they think about that contrast is they assume that parataxis is simpler than hypotaxis, but it's not. It's accumulation of detail, and audiences have to rearrange it in their mind. In a way, it's actually more flexible and complex because you have
Yeah.
to keep track of more things and build out the meaning, right? So I'm about to get to explaining why this matters, right? So in Homer, there's a concept people call in early Greek poetry called the anticipatory doublet. And the way it works is you provide one thing, and then later on you build on it, but add something else to it, right? And when you
Yes.
do that, it doesn't supplant the other thing fully. It builds on it. It's a complement. It builds it out, but it does establish a bit of a precedence. And so if
Yeah.
you look throughout the structures of the Iliad, almost everything is doublets and triplets and ring composition. And to go bigger, I think you can see relationships within poetic traditions and without that reflect that mindset as well. One I'll give you is in Hesiod, right? Hesiod's the theogony, the heiress, strife is born once, and it's a bad thing. Then Hesiod opens works and days. He's like, wait a minute, there's not one strife. That was wrong. There are two types of strife, a good one and a bad one. And people freak out about it. They're like, well, is this a different tradition? Is he lying? And no, it's a doublet. He's just doing what
It's a
Greek
doublet.
poetry does all the time.
Yeah.
Same way in the works and days, to stay micro for a minute, he talks about how Zeus destroyed the race of heroes in the wars around Thebes and Troy, right? And Thebes is clearly before Troy, but it doesn't have precedent because Troy comes second and is bigger and badder, right? And
Yeah.
so that's micro, but it's also anticipating a macro structure. So to go the big structure, I think that the Iliad and the Odyssey are in an anticipatory doublet relationship. I think it's not that the Iliad erases the Odyssey. Odyssey erases the Iliad, but the Odyssey builds on it, adds to it, changes it, and thereby supplants it.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. I'm a big fan of doublets, proleptic and analeptic. Any
Yep.
kind of doublet is my friend. Um, I keep thinking about Homeric characters as, especially the sons of more
Yep.
famous fathers
Yep.
in this doublet thing. There seems to be this pattern, and I think Benjamin Salmon's in the chapter for the book that we both, or the journal article, that the journal volume that we both contributed to. I think Benjamin Salmons talks about that, the role of the epigon, and
Yep.
anyway,
Well, and
I
you
think
also
a
have
lot these
character
days,
doublets in
character
text,
doublets,
right?
yeah,
Like
right,
Calypso and Circe.
yeah,
Diomedes is in a different way a doublet of
yeah,
Achilles, right?
right. And I think these days, I think a lot about Achilles and Neoptolemus. Um,
Yep.
and because the career of Neoptolemus is so strange, you need Achilles. You need to imagine him as the second coming of Achilles in order to make sense of all this stuff that he does.
Yeah.
In my humble opinion.
Yeah,
So,
no.
yeah,
And so, it is reductive to say there are only two structures, doublet and ring. But I think you can pattern out most of what we see in Greek poetry around that.
Yeah. Very interesting. So I'm going to veer into something more personal. I understand that you have is it a dentist in your nuclear family? Is that?
My wife's a pediatric dentist.
Right. So I grew up in a house heavily inflected by the discipline of medicine. My father's a renal pathologist, and I got to do a lot of things on his projects when I was a teenager and in my early 20s.
Yeah. So were you switching out kidneys?
Yeah, that was me, man. No, but honestly, I was at the cutting edge of the digital revolution in pathology, where we were suddenly scanning slides, making digital images in the late 90s, and I was some loud thing is driving by. I was I was working with my dad with photo negatives and scanners and just digitizing images and like making PowerPoints. That was all brand new, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, I wanted to ask you, how has knowing doctors influenced your work in classics?
It's been interesting because it goes back a ways. So my wife and I first met when we were like a third week of undergrad. So, we were teenagers. And, her, like, she didn't decide she wanted to be a dentist until years later. We had already graduated. She was a studio art and linguistics major. We moved to New York 3 months before 9/11, and then the economy crashed, and she didn't like working in real estate and advertising, and she decided she wanted to go back to school and go to dental school, which is super weird. But I mean, who wants to be a dentist of all things? But she went back to school, got into Columbia, and I think then I ended up spending a lot of time like playing basketball, hanging out with med students and dental students, and it really like I'm around dentists all the time. Right. And so, I think it's influenced me in a few different ways. One is it's been a healthy reminder all the time that what we do in classics is not normal or understood by other people. And then I have to explain what I do and understand it, all the time. But at the same time, like, one of the things that I find most stultifying about an academic career is disciplinarity. Right? We get trapped in our disciplines. We have the same kind of conversations. And people talk about interdisciplinary work, but it's mainly just like grabbing things from other places as ornaments or like window dressing for what we're already doing. And so for me, like the conversations and the interests and what we've been exposed to has been enriching. And then, I've been in a way, if not an apprentice, an intern assistant for my spouse. Like I've built dental equipment, I've taken it apart, I've helped her manage offices. If anything, my experience in buying a dental office with her and managing it is the thing that prepared me to go into academic administration. Right. And so those things have been really formative. But then just being around people who are constantly talking about other things is just giving me the confidence to do it. So when I started my Odyssey in Psychology project, one thought was, oh, I need to go back to school. I need to get a degree in psychology. And then I was like, well, you know what? My PhD makes me good at researching. So why don't I just start reading? And so I sat down and just started reading articles for years. And sometimes I don't understand. Well, most of the time I don't understand the science, right? But I can read them and understand the basic principles and learn from them. And it translates that way. So it's been a very enriching experience, but also in a good way anchoring.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So you had an experience somewhat similar to mine in that you worked directly with the physicians, with the dentists in their practices and whatnot.
Yep.
Yeah, that's been, and I get so much joy out of working with my dad now that he approaches retirement but isn't even fully retired, if you can believe it.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's fun. He gets interested in something. I'm like, hey, there's a classics thing I could do with that. And then luckily I have this friend, Joel Christensen, who'll put my Pigman blog up on his site and, happy me and happy dad. All right. So Now you're a provost.
Wild,
And
right? Yeah.
from your I remember, I'll do a little aside about Marcel Detienne now.
Okay.
He had a friend visit Hopkins who had recently been appointed provost and was going to give a research talk at Hopkins. And Marcel made such a huge deal about him being provost as if it was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. And he gave this long introduction to the man in Latin. He composed, because he did it the way they would have done it back when he first knew him, like in the 60s in Belgium or something.
Yeah.
And so he a typical academic introduction for a colloquium, except it was all in Latin, where Detienne was frequently shouting out, "Plaus! Plaudite!" Like, clap for this guy, everybody. It was just so amusing, but he really wanted to rib him about being a provost. And I don't want to rib you about being it. But what are you willing to say about the state of advanced study in the United States 2025 or 2026? I saw that the Graduate Center is interested in preserving knowledge. I saw some
Yes.
concept like that. So what are you willing to say?
I mean, I'll say the truth, and the truth is that we're really in trouble. Not the Graduate Center, but the United States. I mean, the United States built, I mean, not for good reasons, but partly in connection with the military-industrial complex, the most elaborate and advanced research infrastructure in the world. And it worked, right? I mean, not always, not well. It wasn't fair. It wasn't kind. But we had right up until COVID, I think, the most advanced science humanities infrastructure in the world. And what has happened over the past few years is a complete deconstruction of it, and a positioning for it to be a patronage system that leans towards propaganda. And what's going to happen, the sad thing, I think, is that a lot of schools are going to capitulate to the Trump administration, and fewer people are going to have access to the ability to shape knowledge and receive it. Right. The thing I keep saying in every opportunity is that higher education, academia, has three sacred duties, right? We preserve, we transmit, and we create knowledge. The wild thing of the 20th century, especially that second half, is that more people from different backgrounds, and by backgrounds, gender, sexual minorities, ethnicity, everything, religious, ability, more people from very diverse backgrounds were allowed in to the creation of knowledge than at any point in human history. And this created tension, right? We have so many critical race theory, feminism, right? So many things that people find offensive because it challenges the status quo, which has been for 2,000 years, knowledge created and preserved by and for the benefit of primarily white men who are, heteronormative. And so to me, that is a great tragedy, right? We had this amazing opening that people fought for, that people literally died for, and it's
Absolutely.
being closed off. And so my hope, I mean, my belief in moving to the Graduate Center at the University of New York is that this is a place to make the stand, because our mission is the people of the city of New York, right? We have 235,000 students in the CUNY system. And they are majority minority, right? You cannot typify them. They're from everywhere. And this is the place I think knowledge will make a stand. My true hope is that we will be better than the medieval monasteries. We will preserve knowledge, we will advance it, and we will keep bringing new people into it. When everywhere in the US is running away from DEI, we just started a new Black Race and Ethnic Studies PhD program. We just started a new LGBTQ plus certificate. The city of New York can't walk away from diversity because it is diversity.
Sure.
And I spent years during COVID, like in a leadership position in a private institution that I love, that took care of me, wondering, like, what is our mission? How do we contribute to this greater battle? And we are all, the Trump, the conservatives, Project 25, you can look up, they found all the weak points and they're exploiting them.
Yeah.
And so now is the time, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. There may be a rolling back, but the politicization of knowledge isn't going to change. And we need to call it out. We need to stand for what we think is right. And we also need to put people in position to keep doing their work. Right. And to add one more coda to that, last week saw Harvard cut its science PhDs for next year by 75%, its humanities by 60%, following Indiana closing many of its programs, Chicago pausing. We are looking at epistemicide, right? And we're looking at losing a generation or more of possible faculty. We're not, so far, we're good. We're not lowering our numbers. We're going to keep our doors open because we're already cheap and our stipends are terrible, right? But we're going to fight. And I hope that more institutions will join us because I think it matters critically.
Well, Klaus, Claudite, that's great. I'm very buoyed by your commitment.
Well, I mean, I said this on the record before, but one of the things that one of my deans at Brandeis got upset with me for saying was COVID made me stop the whole process of watching the world fall apart from my, office, made me ask myself, like, provided I have grandchildren and the world is still like safe enough to have these conversations. When they asked me what I was doing when the world was falling apart, do I want to tell them I wrote a big book about small things? I don't, right? That's not enough anymore. And, that's my personal choice. But that was, my decision to sort of move into academia, the leadership and stay, is motivated by questions like that.
Thank you. So you, for the period that we've known each other, which is about the last 10 years, you've produced about one scholarly book every 2 years on average. This is my estimation. You probably know better, or you might not. So this question is, how do you do it? I'll just mention, because I like name checking people. The only people that I know who produce that much or more are Irad Malkin in Tel Aviv and Hans Beck.
I think Edith Hall has lapped me. I think she's pretty productive.
Yes.
There are two things there. I mean, one is the term you mentioned, 10 years, doesn't record all the work that made it possible, right, beforehand. So when I arrived at Brandeis in 2016 as an associate professor, I had 3 books partly done. I couldn't write them before for a couple of reasons. One, I didn't know how to write a book. And 2, I had to teach in the summer. I had a heavy teaching load, small children, you know how it goes. And I got to Brandeis, and for the first time, I was paid enough to not teach in the summer. And I got a couple small grants. Like they gave me, I had to argue for this. I got $5,000 one summer, and I said directly, I'm going to use this to send my kids to camp so I can write. And they said, we're not allowed to do that. You can't use it for childcare. I'm like, I need to make it happen. And I eventually convinced them, and they just gave me this grant. And having a couple weeks to just write every day, right? And the second thing was being able to hire research assistants to do annoying things that I'm still bad at, like copy editing and bibliography and all that crap. Like I'm sloppy. I'll acknowledge it. So that was transformative, and it helped me learn how to write, how to finish books. But then after, it was about practice, and doing it every day. I think I had a moment where this must have been 2013 or so. So my dad died in 2011, suddenly. And I got more serious about just life in general after that. And one of the things that happened when my daughter was born is I used to play a lot of basketball and stuff, and I couldn't when she was born. So I started running a lot, and went from nowhere to like being sort of like a long distance runner. And in 2013, 13, 14, I don't know. I ran my first marathon in San Antonio. I remember like I was out with my wife and complaining. I'm like, I don't have time to write a book. Like, it's so frustrating. And she's like, you're a fool. I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, I just watched you like for 4 months with a daily calendar recording how much you ran, how much you were eating, how, like all your other exercises and stretching, like spending 3 hours a day on something that doesn't really matter. She's like, why can't you do that with a book? And I had nothing to say because she was 100% correct. And so after that, like I applied some of the same training practices, right? Doing something every day, understanding that there are different parts of writing. It's not always the same thing. Like you don't have to sit down and write 1,000 words every day because some days you need to read an article. Some days you need to collate your notes. Some days you need to work on bibliography. But the point was having a long-term plan and doing something every day. And I've maintained that. So the story life, I wrote an hour a day over like a 5 month period. I'd conceptualized before. I agreed to write a fast, popular book about Odysseus to get out before Nolan's movie. I'm supposed to have the book into the press by January. As of September 15th, 14th, I had written no words because I'd been busy, I hadn't been in practice. I'm like, all right, I need to calm down. I need to do the work and not get overwhelmed because procrastination does everything, right? It kills you. And since then, I've written, what are we? We are a little over a month. I've written 60,000 words, right? And it's getting up. I do it every day. And the big thing, and I keep track, this is one of my note cards with sort of my daily output. And I just do it first thing. I set aside the time. I write 30 to 90 minutes, and then I just move on. And the thing that I've learned in mentoring younger scholars, because I used to run faculty mentoring at Brandeis when I was there, was that everybody has this notion that, oh, I need 9 hours, I need a month, I need all this time to write. And from my experience, when you do that, you spend too much time catching up. When you write a little bit every day, it's in your brain. You're constantly thinking about it. You're doing the work when you're not writing, and when you sit down to write, you don't stare at the screen. And so I find myself like this morning, I was on a run, I was in Central Park, and I had some ideas. I just stopped. I took out my phone. I did like 2 minutes of speech to text and sent it to myself. And then I had those ideas down and I polished them up later. And so, Cicero has this notion of leftover time. That's when he did his writing, like the in-between moments, the creases. And so I think accepting that writing is what you do regularly as a practice rather than a burden and something you do only in unique circumstances is, I think, the key. And then mapping it out and making sure you're accountable. Final thing that I've noted in my years of mentoring faculty is a lot of people don't actually like writing. I think the big difference is if you get pleasure from the process or not.
Yeah.
I get into a flow state. My wife has seen me writing before. I try to write so nobody can see me. I don't know if you know what davening is, right? The practice of like swaying forward and
Yes.
back in prayer.
Yes.
And I look like I'm davening at times when I'm writing. Like I just get into
Yep.
it and I move, and an hour will go by and I'll look and be like, oh, I did 1,000 words in an hour. I don't know where they came from, but
Yeah.
I felt good. It lowered my blood pressure. It's
Yes.
truly pleasurable.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on all the work. These books are amazing. I was we're at question 6, the final one, and I was hoping this would be something fun for listeners, because you co-authored a book on the Homeric poem, "The Battle of the Frogs and the Mice."
Yep.
And most non-specialists are unaware of this fascinating work of literature that survives for us. So, can you tell listeners about that ancient work and what
Yeah.
you think is the single most interesting part of it?
Yep. So I first encountered the Batrachomomachia, the Battle of Frogs and Mice, when I was a grad student. And it's almost a joke. Like the Oxford text for Homer is 5 volumes, right? Iliad's 1 and 2, Odyssey is 3 and 4, and then 5 is Homeric hymns and other random crap nobody ever reads, right? And so when I was working on towards my comprehensive exams at NYU as a graduate student, I opened up volume 5 to look at the Homeric hymns because they're required, and I was leafing through it. I was like, "What's this?" And I started reading it. I was like, "This is amazing." Right. And so the Batrachomomachia, what is it? It's a 300 odd lines. And it's from a mock, the style of mock epic. And we have evidence that there were actually lots of mock epics, and they're probably performed as early as fourth century BC, if not earlier. We have fragments of a weasel epic. And it's just people playing with Homeric convention. The one we have is probably much later, but the story and the form is pretty funny. And the basic story is, a frog and a mouse meet at the edge of a pond. The mouse wants to go across the pond. They sort of engage in flighting speeches, mocking each other about their lifestyles. And as they're going across the pond, a water snake shows up, and the frog is like, "Oh no," and like dives down away, and the mouse dies because of it. Right, the mouse can't swim. It's awful. And so then you immediately go to like rival clans of frogs and mice, and the mouse's father is a king and is going to wage war on the frogs. The gods are watching and get involved, and they refuse to take sides because Athena finds both sides annoying. She says the mice are always gnawing at my robes, and the frogs keep me up all night. And they get into this wild battle where they act like some like giant mouse has an Aristea, and at the end, the mice are about to actually commit genocide and kill all the frogs, and Zeus doesn't want that to happen, so he sends a phalanx of crabs out to just start attacking them, and then the poem ends. Right? And so, yeah, it's wild. But so I'll get to my favorite part in the moment. But part of what makes it entertaining is that it plays with different structures and motifs of Homer. It also plays with like names, like the names translated are like bread thief and things like that. Like they're silly names. The gods are marked. But the thing that hooked me from the beginning, that I find most memorable, is the mouse is a little worried about riding the frogs back across the water, and he gets on and he's riding. He says, "You know what? This is kind of like when Europa got on Zeus's back when he was a bull." And like I've always been like, well, that's absurd. Why would you think that's a good idea? Nothing good happens to Europa. And so yeah. So I mean, it's Homeric, it's mythical, it's toying with stuff. We did it. I mean, if you can look it up. At the end of the project we did during COVID, Reading Greek Tragedy Online, we did a performance of the Batrachomomachia with puppets. And it's one of the few of the episodes my children watch because we do a thing in it where I get replaced with a puppet as well. And my youngest child, Layla, who's 4 now, but at the time I think was 2.5, I showed it to her, and she thought it was funny, but then she woke up at night and she was upset. And I was like, "Layla, what's wrong?" And she said, "I don't want to be a puppet, Daddy. I don't want to." I was like, "Well, you don't have to be." So, I think it's a welcome respite to the severity and seriousness with which most of us approach the ancient world. Right?
Sure.
We forget that they're playful, they're human beings, they could be absurd, even in studies of comedy, right? It's a truism that people who study comedy don't get the humor, right? And they're just like, no, it's just there's something so delightful and absurd about it. And the Batrachomomachia apparently was super popular during the Byzantine period, which is why the textual tradition is so screwed up, because people imitated it, added to it, interpolated. It's great text. And I have to say, our translation is completely basic. Like we just do it to really make it very clear what the words are. Alicia Stallings' translation is really nice. And Michael Hosty has a commentary that's much more extensive than ours. Eric Robinson and I we just actually sat around reading it together, writing a commentary together way back in 2014 for fun. And then we're like, oh, let's see what we can do with it.
Yeah, cool. That's amazing. It's left for me to thank you so much for making time for us today from New York City all the way to the boreal forest up here. So thank you so much.
You want a little shock before we go? I'm going to tilt the camera. The listeners won't be able to hear it, but if you look over, can you see that out the window there?
Yeah.
That's the Empire State Building.
Wow. Nice office, buddy.
I know. It's pretty sweet. I'm trying not to take it for granted, but I'm like, look at that. It is.
Well, what's the best thing you could do with that is I'm going to work hard. I'm going to work hard. Stay in my office, work hard, like that.
I'll glance.
Yeah, right on. So it was a great pleasure to have you. And I end this typically by saying the bard has left the chat.
Take care.
You've been listening to the Homer Hotline with Dr. Kevin Solez. The Bard has left the chat. Like, subscribe, hit the bell.